Terryl Givens did graduate work at Cornell University in intellectual history and at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he received his PhD in comparative literature. He holds the Jabez Bostwick Chair of English and is professor of literature and religion at the University of Richmond, where he teaches courses in 19th century studies and the Bible's influence on Western literature. His writing has been praised by the New York Times as provocative reading. About this current book, Feeding the Flock, which follows Wrestling the Angel, which is Terrell's first book on Mormon theology, specifically on that topic. As you know, he has had two books come out from, it's tricky up here, two books come out from Deseret Book, and I'm happy to announce that there will be a third this October. The first is The God Who Weeps, then The Crucible of Doubt. The third is The Christ Who Heals. So it's scheduled to be out in October, and I'm sure you'll all be looking forward to that. And if we're lucky, we'll be able to get Terryl to come back then to talk about this new book. And I'm sure he's got a lot more books in him. Ann Taves said this about Feeding the Flock. Givens is to be commended not only for producing the first major systematic overview of Mormon theology, but also for taking a historically informed, comparative approach that both Latter-day Saints and scholars of religion will find highly illuminating. I've been spending some time with the book. It's fabulous, as all of his writing has been, and I consider it a privilege to have someone of Terrell's literary and intellectual and spiritual stature with us. He's done an enormous amount of good, and with his wife Fiona, they have done an enormous amount to help people in faith crisis and just those who want to know more about Mormon history and theology. It's my privilege to turn the time over to Terryl Givens. Let's test that out, make sure it's okay.
Those of you in the back, am I coming through?
Probably needs to be a little louder, if possible.
Those in the back, am I coming through? You know, asking somebody in the back if they can hear, and like you said, you can't, there's never a negative, right? I always thought it's kind of like no atheist will ever be able to say, I told you so. So we're still not.
I think it's not quite loud enough.
Still not loud enough? Now is it loud enough?
Yeah.
Okay, so does that mean I gotta hold it the whole time?
No, I can. Let's put it up a little higher now.
Okay, I'm gonna. Where do you adjust to? Is that better? Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me in the back? Okay, I will just.
Maybe just lower it a couple of octaves. Can you hear me in the back?
We'll get this sorted out. Hold on. Maybe if I button, should I just button this and then?
No, you'll be too hot. You'll make all of us hot.
All right. I'll
How about here? Let's try that.
Okay, can you hear me now in the back? Still not? Okay, I'll hold it. That's good. I'll hold it. If you wouldn't mind in the back, if I start to fade out, then please motion and I'll bring it back up. Okay. Thanks. First of all, I just want to say I just love these kind of events, right? I mean, this is an academic's dream, right? To have people come because they actually are interested in his work and want to talk about it. So I'll talk for a while, but I want to leave plenty of time for questions, and I'm open to questions on any aspect of this book or other books that I have written or have in project, have in process. I'm about 2/3 of the way through a history of the Pearl of Great Price, which will be coming out with Oxford, we hope, next year. I've started a biography of Jean England. That's my next major project. And as Kurt mentioned, we have the book, The Christ Who Heals, coming out in October. Is that the fan making all that noise blowing into it?
I think it is.
It makes it's good for your hair though. It's
kind of windblown luck.
Just gives this effect.
Is that better?
It's like Samuel Coleridge. He used to get so excited when he lectured in public, they said his hair flowed back even if there was no wind. So, the question we're dealing with in The Christ Who Heals is this, and I'll just put this question to you. Do Mormons believe in the same Christ as other Christians? I'm never quite sure how to answer that. Our answer was, if they do, then no restoration was needed. So the thesis of that book is no. It's a very different Christ. And we trace the differences from the pre-existent Christ through the healing Christ, through the saving Christ, through the judging Christ, and so on. So we're thrilled that Ezra was willing to help us push some boundaries there too. I have the feeling it's just, are we okay? Is this...
If you step forward, the fan hits you.
So don't step forward?
I was going to say, yeah, or we just move the fan down so it hits your feet or something.
Okay, how's that?
He's like a fan.
Okay, so let me say a few words about feeding the flock. As many of you know, Mormon studies programs are cropping up everywhere. I remember Richard Bushman coming to me back in about 2002, and he said Robert Remini, who wrote that little biography of Joseph Smith there, came to him when he was writing his biography, and he said, what authoritative academic source can you send me to on the Book of Mormon? This was 2002. And Richard said, I remembered thinking, there isn't any. And that was a moment of acute embarrassment for Richard. And I think the same to some extent is true in terms of our theological tradition. There are Mormon studies programs everywhere. What do you recommend to a student as a basic source in Mormon theology? Or the history of Mormon theology? And so I approached Oxford University Press and presented my plan to them and asked if I could do a 3-volume history of Mormon theology. And the editor said, 3-volume works don't sell, you can take 1 volume. We compromised with 2. So the first volume, Wrestling the Angel, was what I call deep theology. Cosmology, the divine anthropology, the human anthropology. What is the nature of the universe? What is the nature of God? And what is the nature of the human? And the terms of salvation. Volume 2 is what is technically called ecclesiology, which means the theology of church. It attempts to answer the question, why is a church necessary? So even if you got all the theology right, that doesn't say anything about why you need a formal institution to administer sacraments or ordinances or govern spiritual gifts or any of that. So in simplest terms, Volume 2 is an attempt to answer the question from a Mormon perspective, why do you Mormons believe that even Mother Teresa has to be baptized for the dead? And in writing this volume, I don't write it as an apologist for the faith, but my stance is this. As a scholar of Mormonism, I am trying to make the most powerful and compelling presentation I can of Mormon theology as Mormons themselves conceive it. One of the principles of religious studies as articulated by the great Lutheran bishop and scholar Christopher Stendhal was, if you don't recognize yourself in my description of your faith, then I have failed. So I was trying to present a version of Mormon theology that Mormons would say, yes, that's I can countenance or approve of that version. Volume 1 was an exciting project because there's a lot of material, and those are subjects of deep, important interest to most of us. Volume 2 was a much more daunting project because Mormons don't have a developed sacramental theology. In the 19th century, it was sufficient for most members of the church, as most Christians generally, to be told, you need authority. You need authority to administer the church sacraments. And sacraments for a Catholic are necessary to salvation. And so you have to have a legal administrator, no problem there. For a Protestant, sacraments aren't necessary. For most Protestant theologians, they're signs of grace rather than vehicles of grace. But you still need an authority to administer the church, and that authority comes from the Bible. But in the 21st century, right, for younger people especially, I wasn't writing just for millennials, but I have them in mind, it's not very convincing to say, well, you got to baptize Mother Teresa because she wasn't baptized with authority. Like, that's not a very compelling reason, and I don't find it compelling either. I don't believe that God would be an arbitrary God who says, well, no, you just have to do it that way because I'm dictating that way. So I remember when I had a daughter who called me. She's left the church, but still kind of isn't, has questionings and yearnings from time to time. She called me one time and she said, "Dad, why would God separate two people who loved each other just because they weren't married in the temple?" And I thought, that's a great question. And speaking now as a believer rather than as an academic, my response was, I wouldn't worship a God who would arbitrarily separate two people who loved each other. And yet, don't Mormons believe that God will do that? And I thought, no. The question has to be backwards. Okay, I'm taking you through a kind of process by which I came to articulate the sacramental theology that I developed in this volume. It seemed to make more sense to ask the question from Joseph Smith's perspective, okay? What is there about the nature of the universe? What is there about the nature of the human heart? What is the nature about temporal processes that tend toward dissolution and entropy and death, such that if God does not intervene, relationships tend to die? I mean, my goodness, fewer than 50% of Americans can make a marriage last 25 years. So where would one get the idea that humans could do that eternally and make relationships that are celestial and beautiful and enduring without celestial intervention? So that becomes the basis of one of my approaches to this sacramental theology, is that Joseph Smith obviously believed he was putting into place mechanisms that empower God to constitute more durable human relationships. He doesn't keep anybody apart. Natural processes and human tendencies move in that direction on their own. Okay, that was just kind of one way of access into the kinds of questions that I'm dealing with in this book. But let me back up a little bit and try and give you a little more global kind of overview of what I'm doing here. In order to answer the question, why is a church necessary? It seems to me that the first question you have to ask has to do with, well, what is the overall context? Before we know what a church is doing, what is needed, what is needful to accomplish in God's purposes to bring about his plans, which takes us to theology. So you have to begin with a theological framework. So what are God's purposes with regard to the human family from a Latter-day Saint point of view? And Joseph answered that question by saying those purposes are comprised in the new and everlasting covenant. So the first major portion of my book has to do with, okay, what did Joseph understand and how did he articulate and flesh out this idea of the new and everlasting covenant? One of the first and most important aspects of it is that it originates in premortal worlds. It requires, for its implementation, an acknowledgement of the eternal pre-mortal existence of the human spirit. In King Follett terms, the covenant originates when God, seeing himself in the midst of spirits, invites them into association. You'll notice here that in Joseph Smith's original human anthropology, we are not children of God. Okay, I am a child of God. That doesn't come from Joseph Smith, that comes from Orson Pratt. For Joseph, we eternally coexist alongside God as eternal beings, but who have no inherent relationship to him. The new and everlasting covenant is what invites us into relationship, allows us to be imbricated into eternal relationality. And there are at least three aspects of this strategy by which this will be accomplished. First, he proposes he's going to send scriptures and prophets and teachers and resources to which human beings can appeal for direction in the acquisition of virtue and to become increasingly in harmony with eternal principles of celestial life. The second is he will organize them in families and into churches so that in these communities they can be schooled in the practice of love. And then third, he will provide these sanctuaries, these temples, where particular ordinances and sacraments are enacted in order to concretize, celestialize, reify these relationships. Okay? So, I want to pause for a moment to say that if that's how we understand Joseph's conception of the new and everlasting covenant, it gives us a new way to think about apostasy and restoration. Okay? I think the most momentous event at BYU in the last 20 years was the conference they held 2 or 3 years ago on the apostasy, in which 16 scholars from a variety of disciplines and institutions came together, all of whom were united in their consensus that we've done a pretty shoddy job of talking about apostasy. We have borrowed a Protestant narrative that is a little bit oversimplistic and overly demonizing and focuses on the wrong things. And so there's a kind of openness, and the Church Gospel Topics page on apostasy has been revised in the last 12 months. And it's considerably different from the narrative that the Church was telling a little while ago. I don't want to digress too much, but part of what needed revision was the Reformation is not a helpful prelude to restoration. Contrary, I'd be happy to talk about that for as long as you want. That is patently bad history to make that claim. But what it does suggest is that a healthier way of conceiving of apostasy from a Latter-day Saint perspective would be the loss of the overall context in light of which church and covenants and family and all these other things make sense, have their meaning or value. You see what I mean? So I think that the most critical development on the road to what Latter-day Saints refer to as apostasy is the disappearance of the doctrine of pre-existence, premortal existence, which is still alive and thriving through the early lifetime of St. Augustine in the 4th century. When Augustine changes his mind and throws in his weight against pre-existence toward the end of his life, then that's the death knell of pre-existence. And then it's formally abandoned and anathematized by consecutive emperors, beginning with Justinian in the 6th century. Because once you do away with pre-existence, then think about how you reconstruct two important narratives, the narrative of the fall and the narrative of the covenant. Now the fall becomes the catastrophic failure of a plan that begins with Adam. And if we begin with Adam in the garden with a commandment not to eat the fruit of the tree, and he does, and then you get the whole story of original sin and human depravity, and everything falls in its wake. Okay? See what I mean? So what you've lost there is a conception of human nature, of the purposes of mortality, the educative nature of human life. The fall is an ascent rather than a catastrophe. God as a rescuer rather than an engineer and planner from the beginning. Everything just implodes. And sacraments lose. How does one define the parameters of a faith community? Why are those conceived to be necessary, and so forth? So restoration, I'll just say a few more words about restoration, then I'm done. Restoration, and this is the fruit of both research done for Volume 1 and Volume 2. Joseph Smith's ideas about restoration were profoundly influenced by his reading of Revelation chapter 12. And there's a very dramatic self-revision that he undertakes. In the Book of Commandments, 1833 version, the very first revelation where Joseph Smith refers to the church is Book of Commandments, I think it's section 4. And it refers to the formation of a church. But in between 1833 and 35, there's evidence, I'm convinced is good evidence, that Joseph Smith is immersed in the study of Revelation and of commentators, Alexander Fraser in particular, very influential figure in Joseph's thought, trying to decipher the meaning of Revelation chapter 12, which is, Joseph Smith told us, an allegory of the apostasy. And in that allegory, there's a woman who is about to give birth. She gives birth to the child. She's confronted by the dragon, which he said is a representation of Satan. And what does the woman do? The woman is the church, and what does the woman do? Any of you remember your Revelation 12? She flees. Now here's the significance of the wording of King James account. She flees into the wilderness where God hath prepared a place for her. where she is nourished for, and then it gives a long period of years. So, how would this alter conventional Mormon conceptions of apostasy? The woman isn't taken from the earth. She isn't destroyed. She isn't devoured. She is preserved in the wilderness. Now think about the language that Joseph Smith uses 8 or 10 times in the Doctrine and Covenants and elsewhere when he refers to restoration as the coming of the church, what? Out of the wilderness. Out of the wilderness. It seems to me, and I make this argument in these volumes, that Joseph Smith did not understand his role as an ex nihilo innovator. He saw his role as an aggregator. The only thing that he receives ex nihilo from the heavens are the priesthood keys to administer the ordinances, but the truths, the concepts, the ideas, the principles, he's assimilating left and right. He's taking them from Masons, he's taking them from Tom Dick, he's taking them from any other number of contemporary, he's taking them from Methodism. And he was, you get a lot of Mormon scholars who write books, you could name a few, right, where they think every evidence of a borrowing is evidence of Joseph Smith's fraud. But come on, Joseph Smith published the excerpts from Tom Dick when he found parallels. He wasn't trying to hide anything. You think anybody in Nauvoo didn't know he was getting this stuff from Masonry? I mean, it's just absurd. So clearly, he's operating openly, transparently, with this paradigm of restoration that involves inspired syncretism. And how many times did he say, right, if you want to come out of pure Mormon, what do you have to do? He said, get all the good you can from the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Baptists, you come out of pure Mormon. Right? Go to hell itself if that's where you find truth. He was serious about this. So, sure, I enjoy the enterprise of looking for parallels and antecedents and influences, but they don't contradict his self-conceived prophetic status. Excuse me, they reinforce a particular version of it that Mormons need to be more accommodating to. Excuse me. So his main tasks were, as I said, to restore the doctrine of the eternal existence of the human spirit. Another one of the major tenets, I think the plain and precious thing that he thought he was restoring, comes to us in Jacob 5 and Moses 7. The greatest threat to the integrity of Christianity, as Joseph Smith saw it, were not the Nicene and Athanasian creeds, as church literature has had on the websites for years.
If you need a throat lock.
Thank you. That's okay. The greatest threat were the Protestant creeds, 39 Articles of the Church of England and the Westminster Confession, because that's where we get the wording, God is a God without body parts or passions. So, I mean, we make this point in God Who Weeps, but I can't emphasize this strongly enough. In 1 Nephi, chapter 13, verse 32, there's a reference to the loss of the plain and precious things. And Nephi says, wherefore, the people are experiencing, in the original 1830 transcript, a woundedness because of the plain and precious parts that have been taken away. Okay? I think that's kind of our jump into the Christ who heals. The word soter, which is usually translated to Savior, a more literal translation from the Greek is healer. So the way Nephi is presenting the dilemma of apostasy in 1 Nephi is, look folks, we're wounded because we've lost the plain and precious truths. What is the most plain and precious truth? That God is moved by your suffering. That He is personally empathic of your travails. And that is the truth that is stripped from Christianity by the Protestant creeds. No passions. God is impassible. He cannot be moved by human suffering. So that's deliberately restored through the book of Moses, through the allegory of the olive grove, which, as Fiona points out, she's a really good reader, points out that when the Lord of the vineyard, who's the Father, not the Son, is grieving, He doesn't grieve over the vineyard. He always grieves over the individual tree. It's really beautiful. Go back and read it. It grieveth me that I should lose this tree. Right? If we have time, maybe I'll talk about why Mormons don't believe in an omniscient God, and thank heavens we don't. We believe in a God who is situated in time and space, who is imbricated in human relationships, and whose perspective is always shaped by his absolute subjectivity, not by an impersonal, objective stance outside of space, time, and human emotions. So Joseph restores the cosmic drama, pre-existence to possible theosis. He restores the true nature of God, and then he borrows liberally for much of the rest. And that's his conception of restoration, putting back together. Be happy to take questions. Yes, in the back. Can't hear you.
He wants to know what approach you would recommend.
To help me teach my young children about difficult issues in the church. And would you recommend, or would you consider writing a book for parents on how to do this for their children?
And changing diapers.
Introduce the subjects early and gently so that they grow up with an understanding, so that when they're in high school or college, they don't read something that tears them apart.
Okay, we had a generous benefactor who pleaded with us to do that. Said, please, I'll fund it. Name your price. Just translate God Who Weeps and Crucible of Doubt into language that everybody can understand. So I guess that's what I'd have to do, is just, I would have to transmit those things. I mean, it would take the rest of the night. Every doctrine, every problem, it seems to me there's a better way we could be managing it. I'll think on that one. I'll think on that. Let me just give you an example. I had lunch last week with a woman who's left the church. A pretty respected, revered figure in the church who left. And I didn't find any of her reasons very interesting or substantive. And then she said at the end of the conversation, she said, look, what it really comes down to is this. How can we trust the prophet? How can we trust the prophet? And I said, you can't. And she said, what? And I said, Brigham Young warned us back in the 1800s. He said his greatest fear, this is his language, is that members would have a reckless confidence in the leaders of the church. That sounds to me like he's saying, don't take their word for anything. So that's one of the things I would teach the youth, is that you gotta go to the Lord about everything you hear and get a personal witness and testimony. So, you know, like I said, there are 50 different questions I could address, but it seems to me that the myth of prophetic infallibility and how we have mismanaged that is maybe the most fundamental. Teach them what a prophet is and isn't. A prophet is somebody who holds the keys, who has the authority to receive revelation for the church. He's not somebody who gets everything right all the time.
What does it mean and how do we teach our children to follow the prophet? If you shouldn't follow the prophet, how should we follow the prophet?
I'm not going to defend that song.
Will you repeat the question, please?
The question is, how do we teach our kids to follow the prophet? And I would say,
It's not even a song,
well, the song would be fine if we just added 2 words, right? Follow the prophet to Christ. Follow the prophet to Christ. I don't know. I mean, look, I don't think anybody has written more admiringly about Joseph Smith's contributions than I have. But we have fallen into idolatry, even with him, right? I mean, we're singing hymns to the man. No wonder when Lutherans come into our church, they say, oh, so you worship Joseph. Now, well, you're singing hymns to him. We don't sing hymns to Martin Luther. So, yeah, is that an answer? We got to issue some course corrections there, I think, to our children. I love the prophet. I listen to conference, but he's not my model. Right? Christ is.
To expand on baptism, if I heard you correctly, you mentioned baptism is primarily a signification of adoption. And yet, I notice in the Book of Mormon the frequent phrase, baptism under repentance.
Yeah. Well, here's how I would explain it. Repentance, of course, metanoeo, Greek, turning around, a new mind, a new heart. The imagery that Paul gives us in Romans, that baptism is signification of death and resurrection. The Eastern Orthodox tradition believed that resurrection began now. They called the sacrament bread the bread of resurrection. So I understand the two to work hand in glove. It's an ordinance of adoption insofar as we are acknowledging a new life in a new family under a new father. And our repentance shows the sincerity of our desire to acknowledge Christ as our new spiritual head and role model. And that's why the fruits of repentance. But one problem with seeing baptism as equivalent to a remission of sins, and this is part of the problem Luther had that eventually led the Protestants to deny sacraments altogether, is, well, then we'd have to be baptized every day. And we talk about sacramental services as right, rehearsing, or what's the word we use, reenacting the baptismal covenants? Renewing the baptismal covenants. Well, Elder Neil Anderson gave a talk 2 years ago, and if you hear it, in which he said, that's not scriptural. Where did we get that idea? Where does it say in the scripture that taking the sacrament is renewing your baptismal covenants? That's not scriptural. You're renewing your covenant of adoption. But anyhow, so that's my answer to that question.
Now, this isn't so much a question so much as I just want to make sure I'm understanding that idea entirely. So forgive me, I'm kind of reading what I've jotted down here. If I understand...
Louder.
What's that?
I'll repeat the question.
Okay. If I understand what you're saying about this idea that living celestially isn't a matter of worthiness, you said that, it's about being sealed, right? Which sealing is kind of the bureaucratic stamp of, okay, you can hang out with us, so to speak. But at the same time, being sealed versus you and how to live like God, which is how enduring relationships are formed.
Yeah, did you all get that? He's characterizing my definition of sacramentalism as constituting heavenly relationships as inadequate and insufficient, and it is for the reasons that you have just said. So I gladly accept your request for clarification. Because when I talk about sacraments, I'm not talking about just the outward ordinance. Every sacrament we have in the church is accompanied by covenant. And I think one of the lessons taught at a certain stage in the endowment is that there is a certain symbolism associated with what happens at that moment when we are living all of those covenants and the kind of community it qualifies us to participate in. See what I mean? Yeah. So yeah, I hope I'm not quoted out of context as saying the only difference between terrestrial and celestial is that celestial people have had the ordinances done.
No, that's not what I meant.
But the difference is that they have imbibed those commitments and covenantal obligations that whose living and abiding faithfulness to constitutes them into celestial relationality.
Yeah, no, my question was just to clarify, make sure I was understanding that your implication was that part of being sealed, part of going to the temple, versus you and how to live in such a way that you will become that.
Yes, yeah. So the temple is itself a kind of schoolhouse in celestial relationships in Zion living. Yeah. From the back.
I count in reading a few of your works, and you do as well as I read them, more Catholic than Protestant resonances with Mormonism. In the most recent Feeding the Flock, the closest thing I see is a kind of a explanation for that. It happens rather early in the book when it's, I think maybe it's even correct, I don't recall, saying that Mormonism is essentially something like a Catholic reformulation or reformation, or an expression of the counter-reformation.
Yeah.
If possible, could you, in the most liberal terms possible, expound on what you think about that?
Yeah, I'm really happy to talk on this subject because the book needs to be written, but it wouldn't be a very diplomatic kind of enterprise, and so that's why I've been reluctant to undertake it. But the question concerns Catholicism versus Protestantism in terms of their relationship to Mormonism. The first prayer book is usually referred to as the Protestant Book of Prayer, but the first prayer book was Catholic. It was done under the reign of Edward VI. And there's a section of prayers for the dead. And I quote one of them, I think, in Volume 2, and it's a beautiful prayer. As you're praying over the body, grant that this soul might find peace and respite and be reunited with us in the presence of Jesus. The first act of Thomas Cranmer as a Protestant Archbishop of England was the revision of the prayer book, and the first thing he did was strip it of all of those prayers. And he explained why. He said it's a damnable heresy to believe that we can have any interaction with or influence upon the destinies of the departed. Death is final, and it's a papist nonsense to think that there's purgatory or any kind of interaction between these realms. I want you to think about the painting by Brian Krasishnik. I know you've all seen it. It's his most popular painting called She Shall Find That Which Is Lost. I talked about this recently in New York City, the Festival of the Arts, because you know what painting I mean? It's the one where the woman is getting like a blessing, and there are just all of these hosts of personages above her. Contrast what Thomas Cranmer just did to the Book of Common Prayer with that painting, which is one of the most beautiful, poignant encapsulations of Mormon thought about community. Mormonism refuses to recognize any boundary that separates the living from the dead. You can feel as close in spirit and heart to your departed grandmother as you can to your brother who lives with you. And you can be as active in his salvation, we believe, through intercessory prayer, through temple work, right? Okay, sorry, that's just one example. So the first thing that the Protestants do is they annihilate the possibility of a universal salvation that is accessible to all human beings. Second, they rediscover Augustine. And, right, Luther is just Augustine on steroids. So, what do we come to emphasize? Depravity. According to Luther, even the most righteous human individual is incapable of a single good action. So, we are not all involved in this process of kind of schooling, education, and self-transformation. We just come to acknowledge an utter dependence on Christ, who imputes his righteousness to us. Right? According to Luther, we can never be saved if we are judged on our own condition or merits. We can only be saved if we are judged on Christ's merits. So, right? So the whole kind of existential twist of Mormonism, right, is impossible. This notion that, no, really, we're involved in a process of gradual divinization by submitting ourselves to celestial practices, right? Which is beautiful. That's gone. The sacraments themselves, meaningless except for symbols or signs of grace, not essential to salvation. Do we need to go on? The Protestants, who articulate the creeds, God without body parts or passions. So that had been debated pro and con in Catholic theology, but Protestants come down uncompromisingly against any kind of passional God. Tell me, where did Protestants prepare the ground theologically for Mormon ideas or conceptions? The contribution of Protestantism to the world was that it opened up the floodgates of scriptural dissemination, but religious tolerance and pluralism was not a Protestant idea, it's a political idea, right? Come on, they're still, right? They don't come to America to practice religious freedom. They're hanging Quakers in Massachusetts and imprisoning Baptists in Virginia, and Jews can't hold office. So, and I've asked this question, I haven't heard any answer yet from anybody out there as to what is the justification for this mythic narrative that the Reformation was kind of halfway there, but not all the way. It took us in the opposite direction. The last words Joseph Smith spoke in his last recorded public sermon, the Catholic Church has more truth than all the rest. Follow up. I'm just going to say one more thing.
One more thing.
Okay, go ahead.
Maybe I'm reading into my own kind of feeling, but the implication from your points that you said, I think we should move up the hypothetical date for the apostasy to sometime around the 15th or 16th.
No, I would say that the apostasy, insofar as we have lost so many of those core principles, is, you know, I would agree that it's pretty much accomplished in the Middle Ages. But I'm just saying the nails in the coffin are all riveted in the Reformation, and they accentuate all of the grievous errors with respect to the nature of God and the nature of the human. Yeah. Right. And I mean, I was just getting started. I could have gone on more. The place of free will, right? What did Calvin and Luther say about free will, right? It's a damnable myth, right, says Luther. So we could go on and on and on, just everywhere you turn. Question?
I have a question about priesthood and about authority. So I remember I served my mission in the Midwest, and I ran into a lot of people. There was a lot of discussions about who was right, who had the right authority, who didn't. About 6 months out, I just got to the point where it didn't really matter to me anymore. And that sort of discussion kind of made me feel gross. And there's a scripture in the 9th chapter of Mark where John comes to Christ and says, hey, we saw this guy casting out devils. We told him to stop because he wasn't following us. It's one of my favorite scriptures, and Christ's response is, don't tell him to stop. He who is not against us is on our part. And to me, that basically what it means to me is that to access God's power, to access His authority, we just need to not be against Christ.
Yeah.
And that idea is so much more expansive than I feel that Mormonism allows me to move into. That teaching allows my 5-year-old daughter to have as much access, power, and authority as my 10-year-old son. Or my Muslim friend who doesn't believe in Christ, but he's not against it.
Yeah.
And so I guess...
It's a great question. And let me say, I agree with everything you said. But I think you're conflating two different subjects.
Exactly, that's what I was...
Yeah.
Priesthood versus authority.
Well, yeah, exactly. Joseph Smith used one expression 3 times in his career, the priesthood of the Holy Ghost. We don't know what he meant by that. I have my ideas. He also referred repeatedly to priesthood authority, well, I'm sorry, don't misquote me, authority that women had by virtue of their ordination. We don't know what ordination he was referring to. The best guess is by virtue of their confirmation and having the Holy Ghost. I would say that what Joseph Smith was insistent upon is that we have to differentiate authority as it pertains to ecclesiology and authority as it pertains to access to heavenly powers. So you still have the question, why do you have to have that piece of paper to make a baptism valid?
Right.
And I can only give you the best answer that I think Mormonism has for that, whether it works for you or not. And it's the Catholic answer. The Catholics have a very good, I think, take on this. And they say, look, it's human nature to wander, to corrupt, to insinuate our ideas and opinions. Priesthood authority is the mechanism by which God polices an institution to assert influence over it and to authorize vice-regency. Okay? By vice-regency, what I mean is the principle of delegation of authority, which I think Mormons very poorly understand, is God saying, I'm going to turn my authority over to you. I call it the Ring of Pharaoh concept. And what that means is whatever you do in my name is valid, whether or not I would have done that. So it's what I would call priesthood authority is what allows God to manifest controlled chaos, to manage controlled chaos. So we're still going to have Adam-God theories popping up, right? We're still going to have, blood atonement. We got to get rid of that, right? So these prophets aren't always doing things as God would. But he has said, look, I give you this as kind of surety. You've got the Ring of Pharaoh so that there can be a relative continuity and faithfulness to my intentions throughout time. So priesthood holders are stewards and guardians of the tradition. That's the language the Catholic Church uses, and I think it's good language. And so, but all other heavenly powers are equally accessible to all people.
That kind of brings me back on that with Alvin and going from the terrestrial to celestial in that vision. It brings up that universal Mormonism thought that intrigues me, where you have different lines of thought through the first presidency in 1950s.
You're going to ask that question, are you? Okay.
I'd love to. No, it's
all right. All the
intriguing.
recorders off, please. The question is progression through the kingdoms, right?
Sure. And that being said as well, how other religions have certain great access, the Catholics being very close, as you would see it as a true faith, and how there's growth permitted
right,
somewhat outside of that.
Yeah, somebody said to me recently that all other churches should call it the plan of damnation, because in all other traditions, historically, far more human beings will be damned than saved. So why are we calling it the plan of salvation? It's the plan of damnation, right? Catholic Church in 2013 issued a document called The Hope of Everlasting Salvation of Those Who Die Unbaptized. 2,000 years, and they're saying maybe babies who die unbaptized aren't damned. Okay? Mormonism propounded the most generous version of universalism anywhere known in Christian history, with the exception of the Universalist movement that was springing up at that same time. But if you read the writings of the Universalists, Charles Chauncey and others, what they're saying is, it just doesn't seem right to us that God would limit salvation to the few who accept and know Christ, so there must be some mechanism in place in the next estate. But they don't go any further than that. So Joseph takes that opening and he says, oh, you're right. And these are the mechanisms: vicarious ordinance work and preaching, evangelization of the dead. Now the question is, okay, so how universal is that salvation? Are the kingdoms fixed and finite? And here I've met with a lot of unhappy listeners and pushback, but I'm just narrating a tradition. The historical tradition clearly reveals that Joseph Smith believed in progression through the kingdoms. That's how he modeled the temple ceremony. He was heard to preach in Nauvoo that we would progress through the kingdoms. Hiram taught that just as the moon waxes and wanes, those in the terrestrial kingdom can go up or down. Lorenzo Snow, B.H. Roberts, James Talmage, James Faust. I mean, there's statements from all of these people firmly, emphatically insisting that there will be progression through the kingdoms. You've got a contrary tradition represented by Joseph Fielding Smith, Bruce R. McConkie, Spencer W. Kimball. So take your pick. But I can't find any plausible scriptural or rational or theological basis for permanent fixity in the kingdoms. If you look at, Alma says, now is the time to repent. Well, of course now is the time to repent. Why postpone happiness? Section 76:112 was quoted by some of the brethren. That's their favorite scripture to invoke, to argue against progression through the kingdoms. Those in the terrestrial kingdom cannot come where Christ and his God and his Christ are worlds without end. Worlds without end comes to the same time. It's a Hebraic construction, very much related to the Hebrew word eternal. And the Lord told Joseph Smith in section 19 that eternal is not a period of duration. It's one of the names of God. So there's no firm foundation for fixity of kingdoms. And as I said, section 76 set side by side with section 138, it seems to me it couldn't be more plain. Alvin progresses from the terrestrial to the celestial kingdom. So, yeah, I think that's consistent with the earliest and longest tradition in Mormon theology. What is the current official teaching of the church? There is no official position that has been generally released. 2 First Presidency statements signed under First Presidency seal say there is no official position. Under Joseph Fielding Smith, he wrote to an individual and said, I don't believe there is progression through the kingdoms. But you can be an orthodox, temple-worthy Mormon and believe either one of those 2 traditions. I just think those who think that it's fixed suffer the Jonah complex. Yes, the sister in the back. Oh, will I wander into that minefield, you want to know? So you want to know if I'll step into that minefield?
What's the question?
Yeah,
The question is well, it's basically gay marriage. And since we're talking about theology, I'm assuming that your implicit question is, what are the theological directions or constraints on this issue? How long do you have? This is a fraught question, and I mean, even the most gentle, loving, compassionate, careful speakers on the subject are spat upon and reviled by those who hold a contrary view. So it's a shame that we can't have a civil conversation about this. So let me try to speak not as a defender or advocate or critic. Let me speak as a historian of Mormon theology and explain what I think the theological foundations and constraints are relative to this practice policy idea. Some Mormons, the few who have tried to defend philosophically or theologically the Church's position, have usually embraced some model of what is called Catholic natural law theology, which holds, in essence, look at nature, the human body was clearly designed for reproduction, men and women were meant to come together in paired union for that purpose. Therefore, we take our lead from God's natural order. I think Mormon theology is oriented a little differently because of James Talmage's pronouncements and the proclamation on the family, which resituates the nexus of the conversation from sexual biology to gender. Let me explain what I think are the strengths and weaknesses of this position. The weakness that is pointed to by most people is that's not theorized. What do the brethren mean by gender? All living contemporary social scientists and gender theorists say gender is a 100% social construct. It can't have any status eternally. James Talmage taught that gender is an eternal aspect of our identity, as is reaffirmed in the proclamation on the family. Here is the strength of that position. The strength is you are saying that the most fundamental relationship that is necessary to constitute a celestial being, which Erastus Snow defined as an exalted man and woman, is based on the complementary of their gender, not the complementary of their sexual attraction. Because we don't know if there will be sexual attraction in the celestial worlds. Okay, there I've said something which you probably never heard before. But in Mormon folklore, of course there is, but we don't know that. Joseph Smith never said that. I don't know if there will be testosterone in the resurrected body. What Mormon theology does tell us is there will be femaleness and maleness, and that those are eternal constituents of human identity. And so to the question, well, what am I going to do with my same gender attraction in the world to come? I would say, no. I think the church theological tradition is saying that's the wrong question. We don't know what will be the nature of attraction. We will presumably interact on the basis of more transcendent values, which C.S. Lewis, for one, called transsexual, rather than humanly sexual characteristics. All very vague, all very abstract, I grant. But what I'm saying is that it does seem to me that there are the possibilities of a kind of theological justification and rationale that doesn't deny the reality of this worldly sexual attraction, but that says presumably in the eternal worlds we will relate to each other on a different level in different ways, and that we're being too confused by projecting present paradigms onto an eternal realm. And so I think that the church is limited by those theological constraints that insist, look, this isn't about sexual attraction, this is about gender, which is eternal and which has to exist in complementarity with its opposite. I don't see how, I mean, as a theologian, historical theologian, I'm trying to envision how the church can find room to maneuver within those constraints, although they could separate social, right, this worldly gay marriages as a separate issue. And granted, that doesn't have any theological baggage. Okay? But the church, I think one mistake that has been made by church policymakers is that in the rhetoric surrounding Proposition 8 and following, the church official statements oscillated between theological and sociological rationales. That was a mistake. Because one minute they're saying we are against gay marriage because that's not how God ordered marriage. That's a theological justification. The next minute they're saying we are against gay marriage because we believe every child should be raised by a mother and a father. That's a sociological justification. So, see what I mean? So I think there needs to be, and so you also end up then blurring what is our theological projection for the celestial world, and what do we think current social practice should allow. So it's just jumbled. And I'm glad that Elder Oak said in a recent interview, we're still working through a lot of this stuff, because indeed they are.
Better
We out
let
of
that be
time?
the last one.
Is that the note you want to end on?
Is there one more?
The possibility that there may
I
not
have
be
a-
sex in heaven? One more question?
I'm out.
Okay, one more.
Very different question. I'm curious, how do you record or put down your ideas? So I imagine during a normal day, you're very busy academically, etc. When you have ideas, thoughts for books, impressions, recorded on your phone? Do you have a dictaphone? Do you always keep a notepad?
Yeah.
What's your method for recording impressions?
The question is just a kind of personal technical question about the writing process. How do I record notes and ideas for books? I have three, I guess I'd say three practices. One, I do keep a commonplace book with me at virtually all times. I can take it out and jot something in it. Two, I use Evernote. They should probably pay me for advertising that, but I think that's the most tremendous and flexible note-taking program I've ever encountered. And three, when I write a book, unlike Richard Bushman, right, who masters his subject, right, spends years in the archives and really becomes the master of it, and then he sits down to write. I don't have that kind of patience, so I start writing the first day. So
Wow.
It just seems to me, have you ever seen that photograph of Hugh Nibley in his office? It hangs in the Maxwell, where he had like 150 stacks of 3x5 cards. Can you imagine trying to start writing? So I find it much easier to start writing. As I find something of relevance, I'll immediately insert it into the draft of whatever book I'm working on. It's fresh, I don't have to handle it twice.
Great.
And
Thank you.
just how it
Appreciate it.
works. Okay, thanks a lot, it's been great.